This is a 1996 Toyota Prado, and if you live in the United States, you may have never seen one of these as they were actually never sold stateside. It was a part of the 70 series Land Cruiser and was essentially a budget version of the Land Cruiser meant more for on-road driving rather than off-road. And these are actually really cool. So this one was actually originally in Japan and was imported into Seattle, and then the dirt tourist who I'm borrowing this from today took over with it and has built it up with plenty of awesome modifications that we'll be getting into later in this video. With that said, make sure to check out his Instagram down below as a thank you to him for letting me borrow this today. I'll be going into everything that you need to know about the Toyota Prado from this generation. I'm also going to go into the features on the inside, outside, and all of the modifications, and then later on also driving it and telling you guys all of my impressions. Now, as I had mentioned a little bit earlier, the Toyota Prado was geared more towards on-road use instead of off-road like the Toyota Land Cruiser. That meant this actually gets softer suspension, which made it a little bit more usable on road and a little bit less of a bumpy ride. It of course also was a 3-row SUV, making this a little bit more for transporting people and a little bit less about transporting luggage in the rear. And of course, outside of that, it also was geared to being more of a budget vehicle than the Land Cruiser was, because even at this point, the Land Cruiser was getting bigger and bigger as the 80 series had come out at the same time as the 70 series Prado back in 1990. And if you are interested in learning more about the 80 series Land Cruiser, I do actually have a card up above that you can click over to my full review of the 80 series Land Cruiser as well. Now, in fact, actually something interesting is that the new Land Cruiser that is coming out here soon is actually based on the global platform of the Prado and no longer actually of the Land Cruiser that you see in other global markets, making the new Land Cruiser actually more similar to this one than to the other ones. So now the precursor of the Prado that we see here today actually came out in 1984, and it actually wasn't known as the Prado and was just a 70 series Land Cruiser. At that time, it actually only came in a 2-door version with a shorter wheelbase. But it wasn't until 1990 that we got the Prado that we see right here, which has the longer wheelbase and a 4-door design. Along with that update, it also came with a new grille, some new headlamps, and redesigned fenders. And this became hugely popular in global markets, as it was a fantastic Toyota SUV that was a little bit more on the budget range than the standard Toyota Land Cruiser was. And you see these everywhere, however, in the US market, which is where I am, you hardly ever see them. Now, under the hood of the Prado, you're gonna find an engine that I'm actually somewhat familiar with, even though we didn't really have it in the US, and that is the 3.0-liter 4-cylinder turbo diesel called the 1KZTE. Now, why I'm familiar with it is actually I reviewed a Hi-Ace recently that has this exact same engine in it. However, it's sitting underneath of the passenger seat in that vehicle. So this is actually the first time I have actually seen it all around instead of underneath of a seat. Now, in this application right here, this engine gets 130 horsepower and 213 pound-foot of torque, which makes this engine really, really good for off-roading because of that increased torque capabilities. However, it isn't exactly known for its 0 to 60 speed because of the lower horsepower figures. However, that said, this is an incredibly reliable engine and should work for years to come, even though this vehicle has around 250,000 miles on it right now. It should be going double that without any major issues. Of course, mated to this engine, you're going to be finding a 4-speed automatic transmission. Yes, this is an automatic, not a manual. However, I will say after driving it, it does have really smooth shifting, which I was quite impressed with. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about the exterior of this SUV. And as you can see, it definitely follows a little bit more of a boxier design than the 80 series that came out around the same time as this one. There's hard lines pretty much everywhere. Everything is completely squared off, and you even still have these rails right here so that rain can still run along and run off the front of the SUV. Now, historically speaking, the Land Cruiser actually has had a design much like this through its history. And it really wasn't until the 80 series Land Cruiser that it got a little bit larger and a little bit more rounded, so the Prado actually maintained the design. So if you were wanting to get a modern vehicle back in the 90s and you wanted a Land Cruiser, still wanted that boxy design, this is probably the one you would end up with. Now, some of my favorite features on the exterior of the Prado have to be these visors. These are actually Toyota branded visors, and they are massive, just like the Hiace that I reviewed as well. These visors come really far off of the windows, which is not something you see in the US very much, but it actually helps a ton in keeping the rain away from you, and you can almost have these windows completely open without having to worry about rain coming in through. Now, a lot of other things that you see on this SUV, I think to kind of give it a little bit more of an upscale feel, is actually chrome. So you'll find them on things like the door handles, you'll find them up front in the grille, and even in the rear of the SUV. It kind of makes it feel a little bit nicer. However, I will say it actually isn't too much. Sometimes in SUVs like this, they just get really gaudy and weird, but I actually really like the amount of chrome that's on here, and I feel like I probably wouldn't even black it out. You'll even find it alongside the bottom of this. This is actually a decal and it's not painted on, but you'll find chrome even down on the rocker panels of the SUV. Some other things that I like do have to be these fender flares. They actually do have varying sizes of fender flares when it comes to the Prado. These, I think, are a little bit more of the lower profile ones, which I think look really nice and actually kind of modernize the vehicle a little bit more, as they seem to be kind of coming back into style. And that said, the overall design of the Prado actually reminds me of other vehicles of its time that it was competing with, including the Mitsubishi Pajero. So there's a couple really strange things on the exterior of the Prado, and the first one actually is this right here. This is actually a vent. And I was a little confused because why is there a vent sitting right here? Obviously it's not gathering air for the engine because that's sitting up front and this is downstream from the air. And it also isn't for aerodynamics. It's not like it's pushing air from the wheel well down here up through the vent to help with airflow, but what really is it? And I had to do a bunch of research to figure out what that is, and it actually has to do with this door right here. And so when you open this door, and then you close it, there's actually a vent that pushes pressurized air through this vent so it doesn't pressurize the cabin every time you close the door. That's kind of weird. I have never seen that before. Now, there's actually one other really weird feature on the exterior of that, but we have to go to the front end of the vehicle for that. So we're now actually over on the passenger side of the Prado. It's the driver's side for most vehicles, but for the Prado, because it's a right-hand drive SUV, we are on the passenger side. And I want to talk about this tiny little mirror. It's the smallest little mirror. It's about the size of the palm of my hand, and it's actually pretty cool, especially for people that are in the United States, because this is a right-hand drive vehicle. It's hard to see over into the passenger side and see where you are in the lane. So you can actually, without ever really pulling your eyes off of the road, till I see in the passenger side mirror over here, you can glance in this and you can see down onto the road right here, and it also helps out with blind spots. But my main thing is being able to see the line in the center of the road. You know that you're not going over the center line into oncoming traffic, because that's one of the biggest issues of driving a right-hand drive in the United States. All right, so now let's go ahead and get into the interior, and so let's jump into the driver's seat right here. That's not it. All right, so now let's get into the driver's seat on the right-hand side, and you can see right here, it is actually a little bit different than I was expecting. Now, I've had quite a few Toyota Celicas. I reviewed that Toyota Hiace recently, and they all kind of had the same feel. And I was surprised when I got into this, and it actually felt quite a bit different than the other Toyotas that I'm used to. But that's okay, because you do have very 90s style fabric right here, including on the door cards over here. And so you really do get that 90s feel, which is awesome. And speaking of the seats, these are actually really cool seats. I was really impressed with these, because when you push this button right here, it actually does adjust the lumbar, and these seats actually really do hug you really well. Now, another thing that I found interesting about this Toyota Prado is really how few buttons, dials, and switches there were, where vehicles nowadays, and even honestly even the 90s, had a ton of different buttons to compensate for all the different things that the vehicle does. There aren't that many in this vehicle, so I'm going to go ahead and go through some of the most important ones. And so I'm actually going to start down in the center console down below, and that is where there is a suspension button. So that button can actually adjust the suspension to make it a little bit more comfortable of a ride or a firmer ride, which is pretty cool for a vehicle out of the 90s. In front of that is actually another button that is pretty cool that you have a customization for, and that is an ECT button. So there's a normal and then you push it for a power. And so what that does is it actually gears things to be able to accelerate a little bit more, get a higher speed and stuff like that, but it does affect the gas mileage and makes it so it doesn't run as efficiently. Moving forward, you do have your typical Toyota shifter. This is what you found in pretty much all the SUVs, cars, or anything like that. It's just a parts bin shifter, and it's honestly pretty cool and works really well. It does have an overdrive button, as you can see, has Japanese characters on it, which I think is actually pretty cool. We don't see that very often in the US. And sitting in front of that is actually not a button, it's actually a series of lights, and what that does is that it tells you when your transmission is getting too hot. When it gets too hot, it lights up and lets you know so that you can maybe, cool it a little bit. And then to the right of all of that is going to be another shifter. This is what puts you down into a low gear, and again is what makes this SUV a fantastic off-road vehicle. Even though it wasn't meant to be, it is still a Land Cruiser, and because of that, this shifter is a nice addition to have. Now, above all of that, moving into the dash of the vehicle, you'll find all of your HVAC controls, but there's one button in the HVAC controls that is a little bit different. It actually doesn't have anything to do with the HVAC, and that is this idle up button. And what that does is it makes it so that the vehicle actually idles at a higher RPM, and it makes it so that it just warms up a little bit higher. So when you're warming up this engine in the morning or in winter or anything like that, you're going to push that button, it idles at a higher temperature and heats the vehicle up quicker. And then over here, you're going to find a Pioneer double din deck. This obviously is not stock, well, obviously in Japan, because there are actually still Japanese characters that pop up and it actually talks to you in Japanese. I have no idea what it's saying, but that is something that was added in Japan before it was imported into the US. Now, moving to the right of all of that is going to be your steering wheel, dash, and all of that kind of stuff. And I was surprised to find that the steering wheel actually has a little bit different of an orientation. It's more similar to like the Hiace that I had driven recently, in that it actually kind of tilts forward a little bit rather than more upright like most cars are. And so that was pretty interesting. I find it actually pretty easy to drive. It's not really a problem. And then over to the right, you have your hub lock, which allows you to be able to put it into four-wheel drive. And then to the right of that is going to be your 4 high buttons. So that is your higher range four-wheel drive. Below all of that is going to be the 2 different levers. There's going to be the one for the hood. And then there's an alternative to using your key to be able to get into the gas cap. As for the dash itself, there's not a ton to talk about because it's just your typical Toyota dash that everybody is used to and all the Toyotas had from the 90s. Now, one other interesting thing before I move to other parts of the vehicle is this thing right here, and there's cup holders because this didn't come with cup holders, and you can actually tell, I think this was 3D printed and added aftermarket, which is a smart idea. Because one of the things I disliked the most about my past Toyotas from the 90s is that they didn't have cup holders, and this fixes that. All right, so let's go ahead and move into the second row. And the first thing I was surprised with is that this actually doesn't have a ton of room in it. Now, I'm about 6 foot and my knees are touching the front seat here. Now, obviously I can fit in it. It's not an issue and it wouldn't be uncomfortable for long periods of time, but it is interesting to see considering how long this vehicle is. And that probably is because this was built with a 3-row in mind. Some other cool things that I've noticed is this grab handle right here because there's a grab handle about a foot farther back, but it is cool to have there and it helps you be able to get in and out of this vehicle easily. As for headroom, there is no issue whatsoever when you're sitting in the second row here. I have multiple inches before I touch the top of this, and that is because this does have a really tall cabin. But outside of that, there isn't a ton of other features in the back here. Of course, there is things like cigarette trays because this was the 90s. And then there is one final thing I wanted to talk about, and that actually is over on the passenger side, which would be the driver's side for United States people. And that is this little warning sticker. I have no idea what it says, but it is funny to me that it is actually sitting so prominently on the door card of that rear door, which I just think is kind of funny and would never pass in a modern vehicle. All right, so let's go ahead and move around back and talk about the rear cargo space. So these vehicles were built with a 3-row SUV in mind, and this Prado specifically actually does not have the 3rd row installed, but instead you have a ridiculous amount of cargo room. Again, this was built for a 3rd row, so if you don't have it in there, this actually would make a fantastic overlanding rig and be able to put things like drawers and stuff like that in here. Even though it doesn't have the 3rd row installed right now, you do still have the floor mats, which I really like the floor mats. They are all throughout this SUV. It is very 90s Toyota. And you could see that the 3rd row still got things like their own speakers, little cubbies, and for some reason, if they turned around, access to the windshield washer fluid? All right, so there's actually one interior feature that I totally forgot about, and it has to do with the key. So you put the key in right there, right? And you were to turn the car on. Anyway, so you're ready to take the key out, and you go like this, but the key doesn't come out. I couldn't figure out why that was, and it turns out this little button right there has to be pushed. You can then turn the key and pull it out. It has a key lockout. That's really strange. I've never seen that before. So as I had mentioned a little bit earlier, the Dirt Tourist takes SUVs like this and modifies them slightly or completely before selling them. So I want to actually talk about the modifications, as I promised earlier, that are on this Prado. Now, first up is that this actually does have a 2.5-inch Ironman lift kit, which allows these wheels right here to fit perfectly, which these are a 1552 Turbo Mac wheels. They are a 17-inch wheel, and of course they have Falcon Wild Peak AT3W tires on them. They also have added all new tint all around the SUV, and then they also did a bunch of other service work to bring it up to par. And finally, they straight piped it. So let's hear what that sounds like. All right, so what is it like driving the 1994 Toyota Prado, not only in general, but also in the United States as a right-hand drive car? So starting off with the powertrain itself, honestly, it puts down power just fine. I'm trying not to punch it or anything like that, just because it's not my vehicle, but it does get up to speed. I have had it up to highway speeds, generally around 55 and stuff like that, and so it doesn't really struggle at all to keep up with traffic. It has enough power. Sure, at only 130 horsepower, it's not a ton, but that 213 pound-foot of torque is pretty good. I really like the engine, really like the drivetrain. I liked it in the High Ace that I drove before. I do notice this does have quite a bit of body roll. When you go around corners, you definitely feel it quite a bit. It also is kind of feels a little bit extra because I am on the right-hand side of the vehicle, so body roll just feels a little bit different, I think. So it may not be as bad as it seems. However, it is true this thing does drive really nicely on the road. As I kind of mentioned earlier in the video, this was built as more of a people hauler rather than an off-roader. It is still a capable off-road vehicle. I'm a little bit on a back road here, a little bit dirt, a little bit on the pavement. And it does drive really, really nicely. I did drive it up a mountain a little bit today and going around a bunch of turns, and that's where I felt that body roll, but it is an older SUV and that really isn't an issue. As for seating position and comfort of the vehicle, this thing is incredibly comfortable. It does have lumbar support. It actually does hug you on the left hand and right hand side, which does make it great for off-roading because that's what you want. You want to be hugged a little bit more when you're going over those rocks and going off-roading and stuff so that you're not moving around in your seat. They will just go forever. Their reliability is just like no other, especially with that 4-liter diesel. I think it is really, really great powertrain. Of course, it does feel like an older Toyota. It does feel like an older vehicle. So if you're looking for a modern vehicle, if you're looking for a little bit more comfort or anything like that, but still want a 90s vehicle, you're probably going to want to go to the Land Cruiser instead of the Prado. But it does wander a little bit. It's not like really a big deal. I think it just kind of takes some getting used to. So that is everything that you need to know about a 1996 Toyota Prado that we never got here in the United States from somebody that has never driven one before and had a chance to check it out today. It also is really cool to see how far Toyota has come, as I recently had a chance to drive a 2022 Toyota Tundra, which you can find up here, and it is just so wild to see that they are catering to a much more luxurious audience than they used to with these bare bones SUVs right here. If you're looking for a manual experience, something that you can take off-road, have a ton of fun with, and don't have to worry about reliability, and you want a diesel, this is an amazing option. I think these are really cool, and if you go to something like a Cars and Coffee, this is something that people will want to check out, even though it's at a reasonable price. So I want to hear from you. Leave down in the comments what you guys think about the Toyota Prado. Is this something you would buy? And if you're still interested in 90s Toyotas, you probably should watch this video right here.